Within 2, it would be visible with the naked eye. We mourned the astronauts that would never be mentioned in any kind of news outlet. Their mission to expand the scope of mankind had been secret, so their deaths would go unnoticed by all but those who loved them. I thought it odd that such is the destiny for most of mankind. As death finally grips us, we're all too quickly forgotten. Even the heroes, the greatest minds, and the most famous stars will eventually be washed away by time itself, the great unknown of the universe. We're all equally expendable. Once we'd scanned the skies for any trace of debris that might have originated from the station, we finally realized that it hadn't just been destroyed, but swallowed up by the dark rift. It didn't matter where we looked or what kind of probes we sent out to search for the dead crew. They were erased from our part of the galaxy. But in the wake of their demise, something more sinister lurked in the back of our minds. What would happen as the rift grew? Would it ever reach Earth? At first, there was little we could do except observe until a probe could be sent out. A job that, on its own, would take the better part of a year, even with an exceptional amount of funding. Of course, getting money was an easier task when a planet-ending catastrophe would annihilate us within the decade. 6 months we spent observing as the rift was growing exponentially in size. What had started out as a pothole-sized rift had grown as large as a house. We recalculated, estimating that within 5 years it would expand enough to consume Earth. Then, one night when I was packing up my things, dreaming of a bottle of whiskey which I'd need to aid my sleep through another panicked night, I got an alert blaring from my computer. It was already late, leaving little more than a skeleton crew at the base, meaning I'd have to stay behind to deal with whatever minor error it probably was. I walked back to my computer, dropping my things as I realized what had just been detected. It was the GSSS emerging from the rift and moving towards us. The signal was weak, but unmistakably belonged to the station. I grabbed the radio and attempted to make contact. "This is ground control. Does anyone copy?" I called out in excitement, knowing fully well that even if the crew had survived the initial disappearance, they would have long since starved to death, as they were just a week away from the next supply delivery by the time they went missing. "Is anyone there?" I repeated to no response. With that, an emergency was declared, calling all available personnel to work. According to the signal we received from the CPODs, there was no sign of life aboard the station, so we initiated a station-wide forced download of all footage, all data, everything we could get our hands on before the station hit our atmosphere and burned up. People were running around screaming orders at each other as petabytes of corrupted data loaded itself onto our hard drives. We were frantically trying to find a way to redirect the station so that it would burn up completely in atmosphere and not rain down as debris on innocent people, but it was a futile task, and we still hadn't calculated its exact trajectory. But in spite of our best efforts, the station had gone dark. Even with the limited contact we had, any ability to maneuver once there had been disabled, either by outside forces or by internal sabotage. All we could do was watch as it disintegrated over the west coast of Mexico, landing 13 miles offshore into the ocean. While it was not an event easily visible to the public, no one knew the nature of the incoming debris, even had they seen it. We scrambled to send out a crew to pick up what little salvage junk we could find, hoping to at least find traces of the dead astronauts. While the salvage team was on the task, we set out to repair the downloaded footage. In terms of observation, the GSSS stood unmatched. Every inch of the station was monitored 24 hours a day, with the limited exception of the lavatories. We had eyes on the astronauts all the time, not only with visuals and audio, but with the system's functioning itself. Usually it was a semi-live feed, but in times without contact, the data was quickly downloaded, which meant we already had everything up until the moment they were swallowed by the hole. After the fact, there was less information. The first few hours of footage remained intact, so the office gathered around to observe it, none daring to speak as we got our first look into what could only be a completely new world. A picture came to view, taking place during the last moment of our conversation. "Can you repair it?" I heard myself ask over the radio. Matthews was standing there, his face glued to various panels used to control the CMGs.
I don't think so. We'll need to... Wait. How the hell did Holloway get out? Stop it!
Holloway managed to break out and had torn the comms apart. Based on the limited view we got of him on the footage, he looked emotionless. Empty.
Get the fuck back!
Garcia yelled as he held up a wrench. Floating around in zero gravity made fighting a different kind of challenge, but a proper swing could still significantly injure anyone unfortunate enough to be a recipient. Garcia and Matthews grabbed onto Holloway and brought him back into the sleeping quarters, where they tied him up. All the while, he never spoke a single word. He just kept staring at the windows.
What happened to you?
Matthew asked with no response.
We gotta fix the comms.
Garcia chimed in. Cameron and Rikers were already hard at work trying to repair the CMGs, while Jenkins was attempting to piece together what remained of the communication station.
The gyroscopes are more important. If that hole keeps growing, we'll hit it during our next orbit.
Matthew said.
Stay with Commander Holloway. I'll check on the others.
Matthews exited the sleeping quarters while Garcia sat by Holloway.
Come on, you have to talk to us. Why did you sabotage the station?
Holloway still refused to respond. He just kept staring out the window.
Did you see something in the hole?
Garcia asked. That time, Holloway turned his direction back at Garcia, finally acknowledging that he'd heard the question. He appeared to be whispering something, but it couldn't be heard over the audio channels.
What was that?
He asked as he bent closer. Holloway then whispered something inaudible to Garcia, who instantly stood back up in shock. The concern, the fear that had been visible on his face only moments before, had been washed away and replaced by a bizarre sense of apathy. He bent down to untie Holloway without speaking a word. The two of them then both looked hollowed out, just uniformly working together.
Garcia, what did you do?
Jenkins asked as he saw the two of them enter the main section. In response, Garcia just grabbed one of the tools Jenkins was using and hit him over the head. Blood poured out from the wound, suspended in the weightless environment in red small balls. Seeing what was about to happen, Matthews, Rikers, and Cameron all pushed themselves toward the two psychotic crew members and did their best to disarm them. Their struggle drove them across the ship as Jenkins' blood started hitting the wall. Most of the sensitive electronics were secure, but where the blood managed to enter, a few unimportant systems were destroyed. Garcia was by far the largest of the group, and even in zero gravity, that proved an advantage. But at some point in the fight, Cameron managed to get a kick in, pushing Garcia headfirst into the airlock. Then they pushed Holloway in with him and locked it.
What the fuck do we do now?
Riker said. Cameron was busy attending to the wounded, unconscious Jenkins. His wound was bleeding profusely, but Cameron quickly applied a makeshift bandage to prevent his blood from covering the walls of the station. Once he was deemed stable, Cameron joined the rest of her crew in trying to repair the control movement gyroscope. While the comms were important, the main priority was getting the station away from the Void's orbit before collision. The crew spent the next 20 or so hours trying to repair the hopelessly damaged CMGs, but it was a futile task. None of them had known the system as well as Holloway, and with him locked away, there was nothing they could do. Around the 20th hour, a clunk could be heard coming from inside the airlock. Holloway and Garcia had somehow managed to break a hole in the wall, giving them direct access to the airlock's door mechanics. Despite their psychotic state, they were well aware of the station's systems.
Holloway, stop it!
Matthew screamed over the station's speaker system.
If you damage the airlock, we're all going to die!
But the two men didn't care. They were so far gone from their former selves that not even the immediate threat of death seemed to worry them.
We have to eject them.
Kill them. We can't.
Despite her opposition to the idea, her voice was meek. She was smart enough to know that there wasn't another choice.
Either they die or we all do. At this point, it's not a question of morality, but simple math.
Both Cameron and Matthews looked at him in despair. Jenkins wasn't even conscious and able to give input. They just nodded, all of them knowing exactly what had to be done.
Holloway, Garcia, you either stop that shit or we eject you into space. You're going to die if you don't stop it,
Cameron said over the speakers, but her message was ignored.
It's time. Let's just get it over with. As the next in command, I'll pull the trigger.
Matthews said. Everything had already been prepared. All that remained was to input the command that would override the system and kill the crewmen.
May God forgive me for this.
He mumbled to himself as he hit enter. The inner airlock sealed itself while the outer prepared to open. Within a minute, the doors opened and the two men were forcefully pulled into the vacuum of space. There are many misconceptions when it comes to death by the vacuum of space. Contrary to common belief, one does not immediately freeze, nor does your body explode from the sudden change in pressure. Truth be told, death in space is one of the least dignified ways of leaving life. The air would be sucked from your lungs with a great likelihood of rupturing them in the process as the saliva on your tongue boils. Whatever's still left in your intestines would be equally removed. Within 15 seconds, you'd lose consciousness due to hypoxia. I took solace in that fact as I looked over the footage, that at least the poor astronauts weren't awake to experience their horrible deaths. The crew stayed silent for a few minutes after the ejection. None of them were brave enough to break the silence until Matthew finally realized he was now in charge of the station.
The GMCs are done. We need to try to get a message out before the void swallows us,
he said with a defeated voice, albeit with a hint of purpose. They only had a few hours until impact, and who knew exactly how large the hole had grown during the past 24 hours.
Cameron, how are you doing?
Matthews asked after a couple of hours' work.
It's not looking good, but I think we might be able to get a simple message through. But we gotta be fast. We're going to lose in less than an hour. You want the honor? You're in charge now, after all.
So, while Cameron and Rikers went to check on Jenkins, Matthews went on to send the last living message we'd ever received from the crew.
Ground control, this is Matthews. The comms were sabotaged
After we'd listened to the message for a second time, the black void had appeared outside the window. The crew had gathered, hugging each other as they approached within mere meters of it.
This is it.
Rikers let out a panicked whisper.
Oh God!
With that, every ray of light, artificial or not, vanished from the station. A minute of yells and beeps followed as the crew scrambled to turn the lights back on, but based on everything they said, the systems hadn't gone down. The light was simply being consumed by the void. In many ways, the place acted like a black hole without affecting physical mass in any destructive way.
How are we still alive?
Rikers called out.
I don't know. Why aren't the lights working? Is the station dead?
Cameron asked.
It's not just the station. Look outside,
Matthews said with a horrified voice. Outside the window, there was nothing but infinite darkness, rid of any light. There was a strange tinge of blue just barely touching the surface of the station, but where it had come from, no one could say. The weird illumination created eerie outlines inside, allowing the crew to just move around without hitting the walls. Then, the fog of darkness started to fade, and the lights inside the station slowly came back to life as if the unseen force had just been removed. Once they'd secured the inside of the station, they all gathered at the window and just fell into deafening silence. I couldn't blame them, because the world that existed outside in the empty vacuum of space was unlike anything known to mankind. If I hadn't seen the footage myself, I never would have believed it. As the footage played, our offices received a call from the team running the salvage operation. They could confirm that the wreckage definitely belonged to the GSSS, but there were no traces of the astronauts anywhere in the mess. They had not returned with the station. Not knowing what to say, I just redirected my attention towards the still playing footage. Wherever the astronauts had ended up, none of us knew, but one thing was certain. The astronauts were no longer within our realm of reality. They were in a nightmare. I was referred by a temp agency. I had no idea who I was working for or what the job would entail. I only knew that the pay was good. A week-long excursion at $7.25 a night, more than enough to pay off a couple credit card bills and a good chunk of next month's rent. For that price, I would have done almost anything. I only wish I knew at the time what I was getting myself into. When I arrived at the address, I was surprised. It was a large facility at the end of a dirt road in the woods, 2 towns over. The large sign outside read Syntheticorp. It was a plain, white, 3-story building, void of identifying markings. Its appearance gave me no clue to its purpose. Its location was even more baffling. Going off the name alone, I had to assume it was some sort of biotech company. I was probably needed to clean up radioactive waste or something to that end. For what they were paying me, I would be happy to risk my health. Upon entering the building, I was meeting with the receptionist. I was directed to room 371 on the 2nd floor, where I would wait for Al, my new boss. It was your standard office setting, albeit more quaint than usual. Red carpet, white walls, no windows, only 6 desks in 3 rows of 2, each with their own computer. At the back of the room was a large wall covered by a one-way mirror, an opening with steps on either side of it. Inside was a single chair, desk, and landline phone, probably a place for the supervisors to oversee productivity. Other than that, the room harbored no points of interest, unless you fancied the waste bin and the fern in the corner. An old gentleman opened the door to the room and came over to shake my hand, introducing himself as Al. He seemed to be in a rush, wasting no time in describing the task at hand. I was to stay in that very room from 8 p.m. until 6 a.m. the following day, every night for a week. He left me his cell phone number and a laminated list of rules to follow. He told me he could not overstate enough the importance of following each and every one, exactly as they were outlined. Once he was sure I understood the gravity of the situation, he left me to my first shift in peace, closing the door behind him. That was it? Really? Just stay in the room for 10 hours a night? I had no clue as to why I was being paid over $5,000 to room sit, but I learned some time ago to never look a gift horse in the mouth. I simply sat down at the overseer's room with a smile on my face and went over the list of rules. There were 10 in total. All of them left me more than a little confused. 1. Once 8 rolls around, lock the door, and do not leave the room for any reason until 6. Plan your bathroom usage and meal periods accordingly. No food or drink items within the room. Do not use Hank's computer. It's the closest to the exit. No one is ever to touch it under any circumstances, not even Hank. If the phone rings, answer it, but do not talk. No matter what the voice on the other end says, you are not to respond. Hang up after 2 minutes have passed. Do not let the janitor in. We don't have one. If anyone else comes to the floor, let them in, but ignore them. Do not react whatsoever. When they leave, shut the door and lock it behind them. If the waste bin changes locations, place it back in the corner as soon as you notice. If I stop by, only let me in if I know the password. At 9:30 precisely, set each of the computer's home screens to different URLs except Hank's. Do not react to the images. Act normal. If you see Harvey, feed him one of the treats from Lisa's desk, the one opposite Hank's. If there's an emergency, call my cell, but not after 10:05 p.m. Below the last rule was a final sentiment, scribbled over the laminate in pen. No one has made it past night 3. Good luck. I was perplexed, wondering for a moment if Al was a lunatic and if that was the reason no one else had lasted. Perhaps his quirks were too much for the previous candidates and they backed out, fearing for their safety at the hands of this fragile mind. I would not be swayed so easily. Even if Al was crazy, I would be happy to take his money for what was shaping up to be a very simple job. At least, that's what I thought. Day 1 was utterly boring. Nothing remarkable happened, definitely not anything to the extent of what Al's list would have me expect. At 9:30, I even changed the URLs on the computers, if for no other reason than to feel somewhat useful. The next night, however, was a little different. Day 2 started as it normally did. I settled in for another long night, making sure to eat and empty my bladder before locking myself in. At 9:25, just as I was about to ready myself to change the home screens again, I saw it. The waste bin was right there at the top of the steps to the overseer's room. I certainly hadn't placed it there. I felt a small spike in my adrenaline before calming down with a smile. The waste bin, the list, it was all a joke at my expense. Al would be in the next room, waiting anxiously to see the look on my face. I raced out of the office door, and there was no one there. I walked over to the exit and shook the knob. It was still locked. Confused and a tinge scared, I swiftly picked up the waste bin and walked it back over to the corner of the room. I checked the time, 9:30. I started changing the URLs on all of the computers, hoping desperately that I had imagined what just occurred. After skipping Hank's desk, I typed in the last website on PC number 6. I was about to pull away when some strange imagery manifested on the screen. It was surveillance footage of the room. The very room I was in. I saw me looking at the computer. I turned and looked up, but there was no camera. Upon looking back at the screen, I saw something terrifying. I watched as a copy of me stepped out from the overseer's room. It walked up behind me, grabbed a hard drive from one of the desks, and wound up to strike me in the back of the head. I quickly turned to shield myself. There was no one there. I turned back and the screen changed, displaying the website I had entered as normal. I raced back to the overseer's room and sat down, more than a bit frazzled. I contemplated walking out, but I steeled myself to continue. I was fine, after all. Maybe Al wasn't a lunatic, but he didn't seem the type to wish me any harm. Not that I knew him all that well. Still, I hadn't sustained any injury. I was questioning my sanity, yes, but no bodily injuries had befallen me. Whatever was at play here seemed harmless so far. There was a loud banging. Having just had the most horrifying experience in my life, I nearly jumped out of my skin. A voice then penetrated the door.
"It's the janitor. I'm just here to clean up. Can you open the door?"
I recalled rule number 4 and denied him entry. You did good not letting him in. You followed the rule. Now you're fine. So long as you follow the rules, you'll be safe. It's as simple as that. You can see this through. I jumped again.
"I really need to get in there to clean up. Open the door."
I took a deep breath and peeled back my anxiety, successfully ignoring the janitor until he left. This was an accomplishment for me, and it actually felt pretty good. A challenge that I was able to best. Though I remained on the edge of my seat, the next few hours were uneventful. I even dozed off for a moment at one point. It wasn't until 2:30 a.m. that my next challenge would come. A multicolored cat jumped up on the desk in front of me, complete with beautiful splotches of black and orange. I was startled, but it seemed to be friendly, brushing up against my arm, the name on its collar, Harvey. I knew what I had to do. I rummaged through Lisa's desk, found the jar of treats, and fed Harvey one, to which he purred in delight. To my astonishment, he then charged at the door, phasing right through it. My mouth was agape in awe. Once my initial bewilderment dissipated, it was replaced with satisfaction over another small victory. As strange as it may sound, I was beginning to like the job. It was the landline. Remembering the rules, I removed it from the receiver and held it to my ear, making sure to keep an eye on the time.
Hey, it's Al. I'm just going to be stopping by pretty soon to do a little work. How's the job treating you so far?
I remained silent.
Hello? You know you can talk if it's me, right?
I picked up the set of rules and looked them over. There was nothing about Al calling. I didn't respond.
This is no way to treat your employer. If you don't say anything, I'll have no choice but to fire you. Do you really want that?
I stood my ground. Only 20 seconds to go.
Fine. I'll see you soon to relieve you of your duty. I guess you couldn't even make it past night 2.
The 2-minute mark came and I hung up on him. I felt safe as another hour went by, reflecting on the trials I had faced thus far. I was bewildered but determined. I wasn't going to let the room cloud my judgment. I was in control.
It's Lisa. Can I come in?
Though hesitant, I had to abide by Rule 5. I opened the door and a woman entered.
You must be the new guy. What do you think of the place?
I went back to my desk in the overseer's room and sat down, trying my best to act casual. Lisa walked up to the glass, knowing I could see through it.
Not very talkative. are you?
Her eyes unnaturally darted around in all directions, and her skin drooped a bit, almost as if it was falling off the bone. I didn't answer. She didn't speak again. Instead, she stared at the glass for a long time, long enough to leave me feeling truly unsettled. She then waltzed in and stopped at my side, raising her arm. I hoped she wouldn't notice that my breathing had become sporadic and labored. She then violently swung down on the desk, creating a thunderous clap. I almost winced, but held my composure. After another awkward 5 minutes or so, she left. I ran to the door and locked it behind her. A few moments later, there was yet another knock. This time it was a boy, claiming to be searching for his father. I let him in and sat back down. He tried many times to ask for my help, but I was careful to ignore him, just as I had with Lisa. At one point, however, I made the mistake of meeting his gaze. For an instant, in between blinks, his eyes became pitch black, void of all color. Startled, I nearly jolted back, but was able to restrain myself. Like Lisa before him, the boy eventually left, and I quickly locked the door behind him. Another rule followed. Other than the waste bin moving around a few times, nothing else happened that night. Before I knew it, it was time to go home. I heavily considered calling it quits, and may have even had a nightmare or two upon sleeping that day. But I found myself excited to continue, wondering what obstacles the room would throw at me next. Curiosity shouldn't have been enough to bring me back, but all rational trains of thought escaped me. The room had this pull that beckoned me to it. I was hopelessly compelled to return, powerless to its call. Any excuse would have sufficed. As such, I resumed my post the following night. Upon starting my shift, I was confident. I had dealt with quite a few absurdities up to this point, and waited patiently for my next opportunity. A couple of hours went by with no trouble. No cat, no images on the computers, no phone calls, and no waste bin antics. Boredom was beginning to set in when a loud knocking broke the silence. There was no voice. I yelled out from the overseer's room.
Who is it?
I asked. There was a brief pause.
It's me, Val.
I picked up the list and reread rule number 7.
What's the password?
I heard him chuckle to himself.
I never wrote down a password.
He was right. There was no password written with the rule. It must have been him. I cautiously made my way to the door and opened it. Al was there to greet me with a smile. I sighed in relief.
Let me guess, scared of the things that go bump in the night?
He laughed at my clear, nervous disposition. You have no idea. He shut the door and set up some things at one of the computers.
Say, why didn't you write down a password?
I asked. He smiled again.
It's a ploy. Anyone posing as me might try to come up with one, which would identify them as not being me. Understand? I see. Good thinking.
He returned to work at his computer. I didn't want to bother him, but I just had to know. What is this place anyway? Why do these things happen here? He turned to face me.
It's best if you don't ask questions, especially ones that are far above your pay grade.
I wasn't happy with my answer, but I knew it was all I could get out of him. I let him work in peace and sat back down in the overseer's room, watching through the one-way glass. That's when I realized something. The computer Al was using, it was Hank's. I double-checked the list to make sure. Yes, that was definitely Hank's desk. No one was to touch his computer. Didn't that apply to Al as well? I turned over the list on the off chance I might find more information. That's when my heart sank. In large, bold print on the back of the laminated sheet was text that read, "Password, Diner." I grabbed my phone, reached for the scrap of papers with Al's number on it, and dialed it as fast as I could. There was a few tones, but he finally picked up.
Hello? Everything all right over there?
Al, thank goodness. I made a mistake. I thought he was you. I let him in, and now he's on Hank's computer. He let out a long sigh of disappointment. I watched as Al's copy turned from his computer and then stood up.
Listen very carefully. Do not act suspicious in any way. You should be fine if he doesn't suspect anything. If you try to leave or call anyone, it'll all be over, understand?
Yes, I understand. Al's copy began walking to the overseer's room. My heart was beating faster than it ever had before.
I'll be there soon. Just don't panic.
He hung up. I kept the phone to my ear as Al's copy approached, so as to pretend I was talking to my wife. Yeah, I told you, hun, 6 o'clock. That's when I clock out. You don't have to wait up for me. You worry too much. Please, just get some sleep. Al's copy was in the room with me now, staring. I held the phone to my chest and looked back at him. Everything okay? I asked. He continued to stare for a few long seconds. Can you help me with something on the computer? I wondered if he could see my chest pounding. Sure, I just need to finish this phone call. I'll be there as soon as I can. He stared for another moment and then walked back to Hank's desk. Though panicked, I kept up appearances by continuing to pretend I was on the phone. I even acted out an argument to lengthen the call. While doing this, I watched with bated breath as the knob gently turned and the door swung open. I had never been so relieved in my life. He turned to the glass and put a finger to his mouth, gesturing for me to keep quiet. The clone was not yet privy to his arrival. Al snuck up behind the clone and grabbed him by the throat. The imposter struggled but eventually succumbed to his vicious grip. He fell to the floor, a lifeless hull, before disintegrating into the carpet. I ran to Al and thanked him. I also apologized profusely. No need to apologize. This isn't the first thing to make it into the room. I'm sure it won't be the last either. I'm just glad you're okay. He smiled. Speaking of which, mind shutting the door? Wouldn't want another one of me stopping by. Of course. I walked over to the door and then realized something. I had left it unlocked after the copy came in. That's how Al was able to enter. Remembering the final rule, I slowly pulled out my phone and opened the call log. My most recent call connected at 10:18 p.m., 13 minutes past the deadline. I turned around to see Al standing right behind me. Al, what's the password? He grinned. What password? I ran out of there as fast as I could. The room still has a strange hold over me, but I will never go back. At least, I hope I won't. I live on the streets. When they meet me, people wonder why. I've made up all sorts of lies and occasionally told the truth. Even rarer, somebody believes me. I finally decided to set it down in writing, to record it for after I pass on, and so that I don't have to repeat the story. Next time somebody asks, they can simply listen to this. Most people just walk past a homeless person. Some will give spare change, that's rare these days, with fewer people carrying cash, but there are enough kind people willing to go into shops for me that I get by, barely. And even more rarely, somebody will stop to talk to me. Most homeless people I know don't ask. We've all experienced trauma of some kind, and we generally don't like to talk about it. My story is unusual, though. I'm very articulate, and I'm fluent in English, French, Mandarin, German, and Yoruba, with a decent understanding of Swedish, Korean, and Swahili. I'm also very good at talking my way out of situations and persuading people to find common ground. With all these skills, people who talk to me ask, why aren't I, for example, a well-paid translator or diplomat? The answer is simple, because those jobs take place indoors. For the last 7 years, I've lived on the streets of a city in West Africa. I won't name it. I get by on the charity of others and doing gardening jobs, and a bit of bricklaying. In the early stages of construction, at least. I have to bail on those jobs when houses are nearing completion, as you'll see. But I grew up in northern England. My parents are fairly wealthy, and I attended a private school. Not one you'll likely have heard of, but my education was excellent. My life was going very well. I had plenty of friends, and I was getting good grades in science, French, and Latin. I had won a few minor piano competitions, and enjoyed skiing holidays in Switzerland most years. I'm sorry if I sound like I'm boasting. That's not my intention. I'm just presenting my life as it was, so that you'll fully understand the contrast, and so that you'll understand, I had no reason to run from it. You see, just after my 13th birthday, after school on a Friday in June, I was supposed to meet some friends in a coffee shop in town. I was there first, and feeling very grown up, and wanting to show off when they arrived, I ordered a latte. So there I was, sitting alone with my coffee, scrolling through Twitter, when a woman approached me. She was 40, maybe 50 years old, with long dark hair, and wore what looked like it would have been a very nice business suit 10 years earlier. Now it was ragged, with holes and dark stains. She sat herself down opposite of me and stared at me. I tried to ignore her at first. After a minute or so, I looked up and, with an annoyed tone, asked, "Yeah, what do you want?" Her response was just 3 short words.
I'm so sorry.
And then she reached out and touched my hand, stood up, and walked away. I'd never seen her before, and I haven't seen her again since. Now this, of course, puzzled me. She probably had me confused with somebody else, I told myself. It was a weird encounter, sure, but it was over, and it was at least a good story to tell my friends. When they turned up, I was probably a bit more rattled than I admitted to myself, and I had another sip of my coffee and stood up to go to the toilet. 10-meter walk to the toilet, and that was the last time I was ever in England. I pushed open the toilet door, walked through, and was hit in the face by freezing snow. I don't know where I was back then. In shock, I turned around to go back through the door, but there was no door there. Instead, I was in a field of white. It took me a moment to realize that it was a snowstorm and that I was outside. I don't think I panicked. I didn't understand what had happened, or how, but I calmly assessed the situation. I was outside, in the cold and the snow, wearing my summer school uniform, shorts and all, with no idea where the nearest shelter was. I could figure out what had happened later. For now, I needed to survive. Looking around, visibility was not as bad as I feared. It was daytime, the snow was falling straight down, rather than the storm I assumed at first, and I could make out a neat line of trees in the distance. That probably meant a road, and a road meant civilization, so off I headed, across what seemed like a farmer's field. And in 5 minutes, I was indeed on a road. There were no signs that I could make out, so I picked a direction at random and started walking. After about half an hour, I saw light in the distance. I had been shivering for some time, but I felt alert, so I didn't think I was at immediate risk of hypothermia. I kept going and soon arrived at a small cottage with lights on in the downstairs windows. A man answered my earnest knocking on the front door. He spoke a few words in a language I didn't know. I pushed into the house, wanting to get in from the cold before explaining myself. And then I was on a beach. It took a moment to get over the shock of the sweltering heat. I blinked in the bright midday sun and looked around as my eyes started to adjust. I heard the sounds of people splashing in the water and generally having fun. A dark-skinned man in shorts and a t-shirt was running towards me, asking if I was okay. I suppose I looked quite bewildered and out of place, and was probably the only person nearby still shivering. Still confused, but relieved that he spoke French, a language I understood fairly well, I looked at him and tried to explain what was happening. But truthfully, I didn't know what was happening. I just stared at him dumbstruck. He introduced himself as Lewis. I managed to stammer out "Where am I?" To which he replied that I was on a beach near Pohopas. With me still barely able to articulate myself, Lewis offered his help. He asked where my parents were, and when I couldn't answer, he led me to his car, saying that he could drive me to his house and we could figure things out from there. I've since learned that this was a very unwise move. Pohopas in Haiti is one of the most crime-ridden cities on the planet. Murders and kidnappings are common, and there's a good chance Lewis intended to traffic me. But I didn't realize that at the time, and I certainly wasn't thinking straight. I followed Lewis up the beach, where he led me to a small car and opened the passenger door for me. I climbed into the car and fell quite hard onto the tarmac of a town in the early evening. Now bear in mind that I was 13 years old at the time. In the span of about 2 hours, I'd been accosted by a strange woman, trekked through the snow in my shorts, led up a sweltering beach by a stranger, and to top it off, I now had a severely bruised behind. so I think my response to these events was entirely reasonable given the circumstances. I cried. I looked around, found an out-of-the-way alley, hid myself behind some bins, and cried myself to sleep. Somebody woke me by talking loudly. I opened my eyes to see two police, a white man and a white woman standing over me. I knew German only enough to identify the language, not to understand what they were saying, but as I stood up in the early morning, I suppose they saw my school uniform, and the woman started speaking English. Apparently, somebody had seen me there, a child sleeping rough, and called the police. The policeman was very kind. She asked a lot of questions. Had I lost my school tour group? Where was I staying? Did I know my parents' phone number? I mumbled half answers to her questions, and her colleague motioned behind them, to the police car I now saw at the end of the alleyway. It was only now that I realized what was happening. Doors were cursed, for me at least. If I tried to get into the police car, who knows where I would end up? For a split second, I considered trying to explain things to them before settling on, again, the only reasonable course of action. It's hard to run from the police, especially when they know the city and you don't, but I was still quite small and I got lucky. I ran down the alley, turned left into a smaller alley, and saw a chain-link fence a short distance along. A hole had been torn through the bottom, probably by somebody doing something like me, and I dived down and crawled through. My school blazer caught the fence, and I struggled to escape. The police had almost caught me by the time I managed to wriggle out of it, and I ran off, leaving the blazer behind. Good riddance, I thought. It made me far too identifiable anyway. I ran for maybe half an hour, ripping my tie off. Now, just dressed in gray shorts and a white shirt, I looked a bit less like a schoolboy. It was Saturday, and I was just another German kid out looking for his friends. Germans don't go to school on Saturday mornings, right? I wondered. Whatever the case, I didn't find any more trouble that morning. I still had $30 for coffee and shopping, and I followed the crowd until I found a small street market. One stall owner was happy to take my money for a pair of jeans, a t-shirt, and a plain jumper, and gave me $10 back to buy a small lunch. I'm sure I was ripped off, but didn't really feel I had much choice. To answer the police's question, no, I didn't know my parents' number, and my phone was out of charge anyway. I needed a plan. I walked around town, which I learned was called Passau, and found an out-of-the-way bridge near the river. I decided to stay here, at least this evening. It was still early, but I was exhausted and just needed to rest after the insanity of only, I realized, 24 hours. It was getting dark when I was roused from dozing. I was sitting against a wall in a 90-degree corner when somebody found me. After a similar exchange to the one I'd had that morning, he spoke in broken English. Victor was 16 and had been on the streets of Passau for about a month. His mom had left years before, and his dad had kicked him out of his home when he found out Victor was gay. I hadn't realized that sort of thing still happened. I suppose I had, until that day, lived a, pardon the pun, sheltered life. Victor was bigger than me and knew the city. He hadn't lived on the streets that long, but was far more streetwise than I was, and he showed me how to survive. Over the next few months, I learned where to steal food, where to beg, where the driest shelters were, and even how to pickpocket. Passau has a small homeless community, but a closer one, and I got to know some people very well. It's fair to say that by the time my 14th birthday rolled around, I was much more aware and capable. I learned German and practiced my French with a fellow migrant. I learned how to repair clothes and how to haggle with the street vendors. I was still small for my age and found that I could wriggle into and hide in very tight spaces. In short, I proved myself to be useful to the homeless community in Passau. Useful enough that others were happy to indulge my little eccentricities, and would go into shops for me when I needed to buy something. I got blankets and a sleeping bag for winter, and Victor would even charge my phone for me in coffee shops and pubs. It wasn't the life I was used to, but it would be a life, and I had companionship. This all changed after I'd been in Germany just over a year. In the early evening, about an hour before kickoff at the European Championship, Germany was about to play Spain, and there was plenty of people in the pubs getting drunk. Easy pickings for a thief. Victor and I had been working together for a year, and we carried out our well-rehearsed routine. We hung around a busy street until I saw two men come out of the pub, one of them putting his wallet into his back pocket as he left. Perfect. I signaled to Victor and started walking behind them. After a few moments, Victor bumped into him from the side, giving me the opportunity to lift his wallet. But his friend had turned his head to look behind him at just the wrong moment. He shouted, and the two of them turned to me. I ran, and Victor ran the other way, but the two men ignored him. I had a head start, and I thought I could outrun them, but one was gaining on me. In a split second, I decided that it would be easier to hide in a crowd. I ran for the door of the packed pub the two men had just left. I pushed the door open and hurled through. I arrived in Nanjing at night. Of course, I didn't know this at the time, but it was a fairly busy street, and I saw the Chinese characters on the street signs. I won't go into a blow-by-blow account of my time there, which lasted about a year and a half, but in many respects, it was similar to my time in Germany. In a way, I was getting used to this. Living on the streets is more or less the same in any country. Nanjing is a much larger city than Passau and quite prosperous, but every city has its down and outs. I sought out the homeless, and while it took me a while longer than Germany, I learned the language and the culture of the place. If you Google it, you might think Nanjing is pretty safe. For the most part, that's true, but sleeping on the street is no safer there than anywhere else. I found safety in a street gang, putting the skills I'd learned in petty theft and pickpocketing to use. People come and go on the streets, but I ran with a group of 5 or 6 younger people while I was there, even having a bit of a thing with Yihan, a girl a couple years older than me. We would do what we called hit and run. We'd all accost somebody out alone, steal their wallet, and run in different directions. The others met up in an abandoned warehouse, some way out from the center of town, and they got used to my weird insistence on staying outside and sleeping elsewhere. Nanjing has a heavier police presence than Passau, but my colleagues knew where they didn't go, and I did quite well. Until one night in March. We were stalking a couple of drunk men in their 30s and were about to make our practiced move when another group arrived to do the same. I saw the situation developing and signaled my people to move out. Our competitors followed us down a side street. They clearly wanted a fight, and 2 of my friends did as well. I was happy to call it a night and managed to talk them down from a confrontation when Yi Cheng, who was also a bit trigger-happy, threw a punch at one of the others. 3 of them pulled knives from their coats. One stabbed Yi Chen in the gut, and the others went for the rest of us. I ran. I was the fastest in our group, but one of them was faster than me. He nearly caught me. Seeing no other option, I legged it toward the main street and made my way to a shop. The staff were just closing up, but I didn't need to get there in time. I just needed to pass the threshold. I made it through the door. This time I landed in Sweden, in the middle of the countryside. It was nearly afternoon and sunny, so I walked until I found a road and followed signs to Göteborg. That was 15 kilometers, and a few drivers offered me a lift along the way, though obviously I declined. I was in a way starting to feel quite confident now. I'd relocated twice and felt that I knew what to do. Sweden is a nice place, even for the homeless, especially if you're young and white. Strangers were generally kind, and I did well there. However, it can get very cold in the streets in winter, and when snow started to fall, I realized I wasn't likely going to survive until spring. So, in November, for the first time, voluntarily, I walked through a shop door and into another country. It didn't help. From the mild first snow of a Swedish winter, I arrived in a forest in freezing temperatures. I'd gone from mid-afternoon in Sweden to evening, so I guessed it was somewhere in Russia, but I couldn't say. After looking around for a bit, I couldn't find any sign of civilization, so I decided to test my curse. Did that woman, 3 years earlier, curse me? She had seemed strange, but not unkind. Perhaps she simply realized, before I did, that I'd been cursed by someone or something else. I didn't know, not back then, but I knew a bit about how it worked. I collected some fallen logs and branches, and over about an hour, I built a rectangular frame, a doorway. I stepped through. Nothing happened. I arrived on the other side of the doorway. Okay, so that didn't work. Maybe it needed to be an actual door. I could hardly build hinges in the forest, even if I knew how. So instead, I gathered some vines and leaves and strung them into a hanging door from the top like a beaded curtain. Honestly, I was quite proud of my handiwork. For a first attempt with no tools, I was very impressed, and also reluctant to test it. But it was cold and dark and starting to rain, so I stepped through it. It worked, and my next stop was Kenya. I found myself in the countryside on a warm evening on a farm. I judged that it was a long way to the city, and learned that I was correct, so I decided to introduce myself to the farmers. They spoke barely any English, and I didn't speak any Swahili, but I managed to persuade the family that ran the farm to let me work for them. I'm sure they didn't understand my motivations, but they were friendly and happy with the arrangement. Over the next 2 years, I learned how the farm worked, built up my muscles. I'm still small and wiry, but strong, and proved myself to be an able worker. I picked coffee beans, milked cows, fixed fences, and acquired a decent tan. I occasionally made the journey to a nearby market town, sitting in the back of one of the flatbed trucks. I was certainly a curiosity to the locals, but I was treated well. I would happily have stayed on that Kenyan farm for life, but after 2 years, something happened. The farmer of the household was off at the market, and the rest of us were working the fields. I was bringing several baskets of coffee beans to the barn, and then I heard shouting, someone screaming for help. The mother of the household, Anissa, had fallen in the kitchen. From outside, I could tell that her leg was bad. It was bleeding severely, and I think I could see bones sticking out. It was rare that there was just one person in the farmhouse, but it did happen. The closest help was probably at least 10 minutes away, and Anissa was bleeding too fast. I was the only one who could help, but I needed to get in there, somehow. Obviously, the door was out of the question, but the kitchen window was wide open. Were windows safe? The answer, it turned out, was no. I hope Anissa got the help she needed, though I doubt it. But the last I saw of her, as I swung a leg into the kitchen, was an expression of abject terror, and then she and the farmhouse disappeared, replaced in an instant with the nighttime streets of Seoul. Again, I had to start over, and again, I had to learn a new language. English isn't well spoken in Korea, and it took some time before I could get on. I made a few friends and supported myself largely by stealing and pickpocketing. Without the kind of network I'd built up in Germany and China, things were more difficult. I got caught a few times and escaped before anything serious happened. Until after about a year. I guess that the police had gotten a few reports of the street thefts in my area. I noticed an increased police presence, and one day, I just got sloppy. A couple were having coffee outside a cafe at lunchtime. The man's wallet was on the table between them, and I was hungry. I pulled my hoodie over my face, ran, and grabbed the wallet. While I was running away, I pulled the cash out and threw the wallet on the ground. Then, 10 minutes later, the police found me. I'd found another cafe with outdoor services. It wasn't far enough away, and I guess I hadn't hidden my face as well as I thought. I wasn't in a tourist area, and it was pretty easy to identify the only white man around, especially as I was wearing the same clothes. I saw 2 police walking towards me and started to run, but this time they were faster. They tackled me to the ground and bundled me into their patrol car. It was dark, too dark to see anything. At first, I assumed I was on the other side of the world at night. But as my eyes adjusted, I realized I was underground. I was in a vast cavern. There was minimal light coming from a few burning torches in the distance. The ground was rough but solid, and the air was chilly, but no colder than the average night on the street in most towns. I could make out very little at first, and decided to head towards the torches while I figured out what my new situation was. As I got closer, I realized the torches surrounded a pit, and I could make out people under the torches. Some of them looked up as I approached, but they didn't say anything. All were inside the pit, which I could now see covered a rough square, maybe 30 meters to a side. And then I heard something else. A kind of chittering. To the side, I saw creatures. Not human, nor like any animal I'd ever seen before. They were about 1 meter tall and walked on 4 chitinous legs with 2 arms in front of them. Their bodies were black and glossy, and their heads had large jaws and mandibles. In science class years ago, we had stag beetles in a fish tank. These creatures reminded me of those. The beetles came towards me. There were 6 of them, and while they were smaller than me, they quickly overpowered me, all while making horrific clicking and chittering sounds. They took me to the edge of the pit. 2 more beetles standing there pushed a long wooden ramp down into the pit, and the others pushed me down it, and then took the ramp back up. I was stuck, or so it seemed. The walls were too high and smooth to climb easily, and I now noticed several more beetles standing guard at intervals along the wall. Even if I got out, I had no idea where I was or what kind of problem I found myself in this time. The humans I was with numbered about 50, quite diverse but young. There were teenagers and people in their 20s, but no older. At 19, I was pretty much in the middle age-wise. A woman approached me and started speaking French. Great, at least I could understand her. It's impossible to tell time down in that underground cavern, but I gathered it was about the start of their effective nighttime. The woman, who introduced herself as a Parisian named Josie, explained that the beetles used them for labor and other things. They kept them fed and made them work for half the day, but otherwise, more or less, left them alone. Josie introduced me to the others, showed me to the food, almost exclusively berries and mushrooms, and told me to fill my belly and rest as well as I could, as I would be put to hard work the next day. She was right. The next day I was awoken by a human, Carl, shaking me. The beetles had already set up the ramp and were bringing us up in groups of 4. I had no intention of being used as a slave, but decided against taking action until I'd figured things out a bit more. My group was led down a maze of tunnels for about 20 minutes until we arrived at a broader cave, though much smaller than the main cavern. One of the beetles had a flat piece of slate on which they had drawn a chalk diagram. They may not be able to speak human languages, but they can hold things with their front limbs and draw. It pointed to each of us in turn, then to a pair of drawings, then to the area of the cave. Jerome, a dark-skinned man from Senegal, explained what I had already figured out. The beetles wanted us to excavate the cave, according to the plan on the slate. There were some crude pickaxes and other tools already in the cave. I looked at the sharp, heavy tools and looked at the 2 small beetles. Jerome mouthed no to me. I learned later that people have tried that before, and they always ended up dead. The creatures were stronger than they looked. So I got to work pickaxing and chiseling out the room for the insects. After maybe an hour, the beetles left. Sandy, a Canadian girl of 15, told me that while we could speak freely, the tunnels were maze-like. She had run once, but if there were anywhere to go, she hadn't found it. The beetles had left a few torches for us to work by, but they had much better night vision than we did, and while we could get lost in the tunnels, they could seemingly make their way just fine in complete darkness. I think insects lay trails using pheromones as well, so they don't even need to see in the tunnels. And so it continued for a long time. I carved out cave rooms, made what I believe was insect furniture, but I still don't know where they got the wood, and even worked a forge. We marked our days by our rest periods, and long ago, somebody had started scratching lines into the wall of the pit to mark each day. As had become tradition, I scratched my name above the day I arrived. This was day 11,408 since the calendar had started, 31 years earlier. We spent our evenings telling stories, true stories of our lives outside, stories we could remember reading, and stories we made up ourselves during the long working days. I suggested singing once, but was shot down immediately. Apparently the Beatles really didn't like human songs. Just like living on the streets, people come and go. Haruki, a Japanese man of 25, was crushed by a falling rock in an excavation. I wasn't in the same group, but I heard the screams echoing through the corridors. In accordance with our tradition, we scratched his name below the line for that day. Arrivals are marked above, and departures, as we euphemistically called deaths, below the timeline. Jason appeared after a few months, followed shortly by Louis, in much the same way I had. And then Caroline, a 16-year-old girl from Mexico, lost it when we were being corralled into a pit at the end of the day. Everyone can snap if they're pushed too far, and as she reached the ramp, Caroline screamed and shouted and then ran into the darkness. Some of the insects followed her, and this is when I learned how fast they can move. They caught up with Caroline after only a few seconds and dragged her to the edge of the pit, pinning her down until the rest of us were all the way in there and they had pulled up the ramp. More beetles had arrived, and then, in full view of all of us, they ripped her apart. Her flesh tore as mandibles slashed into her body. I watched, incapable of helping but unable to look away, as she screamed in agony until her windpipe was severed, and then they started to eat her. It took about 10 minutes in all, and at the end there was nothing left. No sign that anything had happened except for the blood that trickled down the wall of the pit. We saw and heard it all, the rending of flesh, the crunching of bone, the chittering of the insects in what I could only interpret as excitement. When they were finished, the beetles stood on the wall, looked down on us, and walked away like nothing had happened. We were in shock, of course. There were no stories told that evening. In fact, nobody spoke as Carl scratched Caroline below the mark for that day. We went to sleep in silence, though I don't know if any of us actually slept that night. I certainly didn't. The next day continued as normal. We worked in subdued silence. We returned to the pit. We ate our meager meals of berries and fungi. I was the first to speak. My life down there wasn't great, but it was something I could get on with. Something in which I could find a certain level of contentment, not any longer. So for the first time, I asked about the doors. Most of my fellows hadn't properly realized that doors were the triggers. It seemed like I was the only one who had traveled anywhere else. The underground realm was the first and only trip any of the others had made. Simon, a fellow Englishman, told me that he had once taken some items to the creatures' homes. They lived in carved caves, presumably mined out by the previous generation of human captives, and while he didn't understand their culture, they clearly had decorations. While there, he saw a large slate with a chalk face drawn on it, a human face, one that he didn't recognize, until Jenny had arrived a few days later. He hadn't mentioned this at the time, but it helped me start to put the pieces together, I think. I don't understand the curse, but I believe the creatures marked me. The other humans in that place hadn't traveled around like I did. Their first trips through a door took them to the underground. I think the woman in the coffee shop recognized that I was marked and tried to help. I think when she touched me, she disrupted the curse, randomizing my destination. And I thought back to the time I tried to help Anissa back in the Kenyan farmhouse, and the look on her face as I portaled away. I wonder what she had seen as I disappeared. This was interesting, but it didn't really help us. Then I talked about my travels, how any door or even window acted as a portal, how I had created my own, and it didn't work until I put a door into the doorway, and gradually we formed a plan. Most of the floor of the pit was made out of smooth stone, but there was a small area of earth a couple of meters away. Our captors rarely came down into the pit. They threw food down from above. We carried waste out in buckets, and they didn't need to come down to bring us up, as they would simply withhold food if we refused, as Jerome recalled from years earlier. It was a simple plan, but a slow one. Over the next few months, we smuggled tiny bits of stone, wood, and whatever else we could hide on our person. First, we built a wooden board, just small enough to cover the soil. One person would dig out soil from below the board, while the rest of us kept watch. The beetles have small eyes, and although their night vision is excellent, I don't think they can see very well at a distance, relying more on smell. So, if we were careful, we could work without being noticed, and we were careful. If we were caught at any stage of the plan, it would be game over. We worked for less than an hour each night, covering the hole with the board and hiding the board with soil. Extracted earth went little by little with our waste buckets. After some time, we hit solid rock, but the hole was now about 1.5 meters deep. It was enough. Phase 2 of the plan was riskier. Carving into the solid sections of the wood with sharp rocks made a sound a lot like the beetles' screech, and we knew they had good hearing. We only dared do a tiny bit each night, but eventually we had a frame and a door. All we needed now was a hinge. Slowly, we scraped out 3 holes along one side of the door and tied it to the frame with some braided roots we had gathered from the caves. It was done. I doubted it would hold together for long, but it didn't need to. We held a quiet celebration as much as we could down there, and Lewis carved a final message at the end of the timeline. Fuck you. Sandy volunteered to be the first to test it. For all 50 of us to make it, we would need to move fast, and this is why we decided to use a trapdoor. It would be quicker to jump down, one after another, than to wriggle horizontally through a doorway that size. We checked the surroundings, and seeing only a couple of beetles not paying much attention to us, we decided on our order. I was number 14. Sandy carefully uncovered the trapdoor, opened it, jumped down, and disappeared. It worked. Trying to contain our excitement, we followed through in our agreed order. As number 11 jumped in, I heard chittering from above. They had noticed something, but we could do nothing about that. We kept filing in until I jumped down. This is when I arrived in Western Africa, where I've lived for the last 7 years, and where I hope to live the rest of my natural life. 13 others had entered the portal before me, but they were nowhere to be seen. I hope, that they are living safely elsewhere, away from the clutches of those monstrous slavers. I pray every night that those behind me in line got away before the creatures reached us, but I haven't heard from them. I'm not sure how I could, unless one of them is hearing this. I still don't know how that woman in the coffee shop knew about me. Perhaps she herself had been there, in that cave, or after one, and escaped it. It would make sense, given the state of her clothes, or maybe she's something else. A psychic, perhaps. She could walk through doors, and maybe I can now too. Maybe when I left the underground realm the curse was broken, but I don't dare risk it. Maybe one day I'll see somebody else who is marked and recognize them. I could hardly warn them of the danger. Nobody would believe me, but I can touch their skin and disrupt the curse. I've escaped, but the insect things are still there, and who knows how many other colonies they have. It's hard to get exact figures, but in the United States alone, 6,000 people a year go missing and are never found. How many of them are trapped underground, enslaved by a species that regards humans as nothing more than a source of labor and food?